Right, I think I'm just going to dive straight into it. My name is Bill Ridgers. Welcome to this panel on exporting EdTech. And I guess the big question is, why is EdTech not a bigger export industry? First of all, excuse my voice. I've got a terrible cold, so I'm going to do as little talking as possible. But fortunately, we have 6 excellent and very knowledgeable panel members who are going to make my job very easy. I'm going to just ask them to go along the panel just to introduce themselves, just say who you are and which company you work for, which university you come from.
Hi, everyone.
Hello? Yeah, it's working.
All right. Giuseppe Oricchio. I work at IESE Business School based in Barcelona with campuses in Madrid, Munich, New York, and Sao Paulo.
Patrick Brothers is CEO of Navitas Ventures. We work with 40 universities around the world and run dedicated freshman colleges on campus for their international students.
I'm Andrew Hamilton. I'm the president of New York University, your hosts for this event. I started as president just a little under 2 years ago. Prior to coming to NYU, I was the vice chancellor, which is the equivalent of president at the University of Oxford in the UK. And then prior to that, I was the provost of Yale in Connecticut.
It's a hard guy to follow. I'm Denise Gallucci. The microphone's not on, but I don't need it. I work for GEMS Education. We're the largest provider of private education worldwide. We have private schools, K-12, across 20 countries. I also serve as the chief exec of the Education Partners, which is our education consultancy division. It's good to be here.
I'm Charles Fadel. I'm a founder of the Center for Curriculum Redesign. I teach at Harvard now after 25 years in technology, starting back with a neural networks startup way back when it was not in fashion as it is now.
I'm Luyan Cho. I'm the Chief Product Strategy Officer for Pearson Education. And I actually came to Pearson by way of an acquisition of a company called an EdTech startup called SchoolNet in 2011. So I'm living proof that there is life for entrepreneurs after the acquisition in corporate America.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you. Let's dive straight into it. We've got a lot of topics, I think, to cover, and hopefully we'll cover a lot of ground in the next hour and a half or so. And we'll have plenty of time, I think, as part of that, to take questions. But I'm going to start with Lu Yen, and I'd like you to sort of set the scene. How big is the EdTech market at the moment, and what are the sort of comparable, how does it compare to other industries?
Sure. Well, so maybe pulling the lens back for a minute a little further, I think, the general view, consensus is that the education industry in general, as a global industry, is about a $5 trillion a year business. And if you compare it to other global industries, whether it's media and entertainment, or it's healthcare, or it's military industrial, it is, almost any way that you analyze it, it's a top 10 global industry. What's interesting, and Bill, you and I exchanged a slide about this, some analysis on this. Something that I find very interesting is, despite its incredible size as an industry or as a market, it has remained elusive in terms of its addressability as a market. And so, in general, if you look at large global sectors like media and entertainment, and then you look at the total value of the public companies, the total market cap within that sector, there's about an 80% rule, right? So the total value of public companies within media and entertainment is, I can't remember the exact numbers, it's probably like $7 trillion, and the total market is probably $8-something trillion. And you can go across all the top industries, and that rule is really pretty solid. The total value of all of the public companies in global education is $200 million. So it tells you something, right? It tells you that we've yet to really figure out how to address education as a global market, as a global industry. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, not surprisingly, education continues to be very local, very fragmented, very culture-bound, and Also, I think EdTech maybe, on the one hand, provide an opportunity to change that, but also on the other hand, I think, is challenged by the fact that the availability of technology is so uneven across markets and across different parts of the world. And so, for those of us who, Pearson is the largest, producer of educational content and services in the public markets. I think we feel that the education industry as a whole is kind of like where healthcare was 50 to 75 years ago. And we probably have, the big question is, will technology collapse that time frame, right? Is it going to be another 50 to 75 years before we see the 80% rule come into effect? Or will technology collapse that time period to a much shorter period of time? We just don't know.
Denise, you're from a global education network. Do you feel that you have the scale to compete globally?
So it's interesting. We see such a need for high quality education across the world, and so much of our success is in emerging markets, where the supply-demand disparity is so great. So when you look at what Lu Yen is saying about the addressable market and the size and scale of what's possible, that's what we're living on a daily basis. What stops us from growing even more quickly than we have, when we say we're across 20 countries, in the next 15 minutes it could be 21. And the number of schools that we have within the next 20 minutes could grow by 10. The growth that we're experiencing at GEMS Education is exponential, and it's bigger than what we can handle at this point in time. And the two things that hold us back are capital and access to talent. And that's where we find the bringing high quality access on an equal basis across the globe, given that much of what we do in our private schools is face-to-face, brick and mortar, non-traditional education in a traditional setting. We feel that there's absolutely the ability to scale when the need is there and the willingness of government to allow private education is also there.
So I'd like to come on to both the talent question and the government regulation question, but on the capital question, why are people not, if you have this huge potential market, why are people not knocking at your door, private equity firms and VCs and what have you, and giving you capital?
So our door is knocked on often, and our Middle Eastern group, we divested 20% 4 years ago. Blackstone and a group of sovereign wealth funds own 20% of our Middle East, North Africa, South Asia, mainly based in Dubai. But we're patient capital. And so when you look at education and you look at the time horizon that you need, there are two bottom lines. The first is always outcomes for students. And GEMS Education is known for producing the highest outcomes across the socioeconomic continuum. So we have schools in India at $250 per pupil per annum, to schools in Chicago at $35,000, $40,000 per pupil per annum. And across the socioeconomic spectrum, our students are high performing. And so it is for that reason that the focus on outcomes, sometimes the time horizon for private equity is a little too short for the time it takes to produce quality outcomes for students. And GEMS and hopefully other education groups look at the outcomes for students only first. And then the second bottom line always comes when the outcomes are there.
If I could ask Patrick, to what extent does the industry suffer from the fact it has so many small players? And, we see, why is there's no Amazon of education, there's no Expedia of education? To what extent does that hinder its growth?
Yeah, education, especially K-12, which is I think where most of the startups or most of the innovation is happening. In aggregate is, it's a highly fragmented market itself, and innovation is highly fragmented, I think, in its nature. It's about experimentation and lots of experimentation. And so talking to schools and universities, one of their frustrations is how do we vet, how do we qualify all of these, fantastic ideas and fantastic teams and fantastic technologies, but to the outcomes and the evidence point, most of those teams prioritize sales and marketing over evidence-based, evidence-based proposals. And so, we've seen some fascinating initiatives and research at the moment, which is trying to essentially address what you might describe as a procurement problem. Lots of technology and lots of innovation trying to service the space in a highly fragmented nature. That's innovation, it's fragmented, it's experimentation. So, will we see the consolidation? I think in some respects, consolidation would be fantastic because schools and universities wouldn't be faced with how to assess, 100 different ideas. But I think it's more likely we'll see the consolidation of standards that we start to converge on. And then we can still, benefit from, high volumes of innovation and teams experimenting and capital and the like, but we can start to get a bit more organised, whether it's in learning analytics, whether it's in administration or the like. Those standards will start to emerge, I think, and that will help solve the innovation problem for both sides of the market.
Excuse me, if I could ask Alexander, as a player as a sort of non-commercial player, if you like.
Do you mean Andrew?
Sorry, Andrew, I beg your pardon. Andrew, if I could
Alexander Hamilton was someone entirely different, who has a very good PR team at the moment in New York City, let me tell you.
Clearly walking down Broadway has muddled my brain. Andrew, as somebody who comes in this not necessarily as a sort of commercial player, to what extent do you feel the pressure to act commercially when you're up against firms who are looking to grow and looking to be a sort of commercial success? How do you deal with that?
Universities are constantly reinventing themselves. I would even argue that there's a surprising level of coordination. Just to make reference to Patrick's point, standards in universities have common connection. Accrediting agencies ensure that a degree in chemistry at Harvard is similar to a degree in chemistry at Yale, a degree in chemistry at NYU. There's a remarkable level of commonality in the way in which we present education at the university level. And Bill, in terms of commercial competition, of course, that's constantly there. We know well that the opportunities for students, particularly students outside the traditional 18 to 22-year-old, who has been so much of the base for universities around the world, that they have many options, many alternatives, and a good number of those are commercial. They're online courses, ever increasing in quality and in connection to degree programs. Just in listening to the comments that we've had so far, obviously universities in particular represent a very, very long-standing structure. I mentioned at the beginning, I was at the University of Oxford before coming to NYU. It's worth just reminding oneself the University of Oxford is nearly 900 years old. So this is a model that's undergone quite a lot of changes in its history and survived significant numbers of threats, both technological, social, political.
I mean, I guess that could be said for lots of industries. Say that just before they're kind of wiped
blown
out
apart.
by disruption, right?
That's a fair comment. And the argument I would make is that we respond and have done over decades, over centuries, to threats. And this isn't a threat, it's actually an opportunity. And we see very much the impact of technology on learning in universities in very significant ways. We incorporate it into the way we teach. And, is there still tradition at universities? Of course there is. But you can see very significant change over the past 5 years, over the past 10 years, over the past 15 years.
If I recall correctly, Andrew, I remember your opening remarks last year were that the bubonic plague was was a crisis.
Don't steal my jokes. But but again, in all seriousness, the digital revolution, online learning is a very important transforming technological breakthrough. But so was the printing press. And, Oxford was 300 years old when the printing press was invented, and books were absorbed into university education in a fairly effective way. And I would argue we are in the early stages, I agree, the early stages of the absorbing of online technologies, digital technologies into the way we teach, the way we carry out research. A very important part of universities goes beyond the role we have in teaching. It's also the role we have in research and the way in which teaching informs research and research teaching.
I guess everyone on this panel would accept that technology has the capacity to change things quickly, to change things overnight in the way that the printing press took many years to change things. But technology has the capacity to change things within years, within a very short period of time. Now, Giuseppe, Yesay is another sort of well-regarded institutions. Do you feel that you are nimble enough as an institution to sort of deal with things, very fast-changing things in the way that, for example, a private company might be able to?
That's a good question. I think, so how would I answer that? I think, it is true, yes, the printing press and other examples of transformation have, sprinkled our past, right? But the difference today is, I think, really the speed of the change. And coping with that speed of change, whether you're in a corporate or in a business school, is the challenge. And it's not the fact that your business model will be changed today, it's the fact that your business model is going to change tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. And so the biggest, and to your question of nimble, the biggest constraint that a school has, but this is shared by many corporates, is actually in the organizational model itself and its ability to cope with rapid change. And that's true of most companies as well, I would say. I think digital transformation is not about changing your business model, it's about changing your organizational model to cope with constant change. That's when digital transformation will end. When you built that organization, and that organization is an agile organization, it's a customer-centric organization, it's a cross-silo organization, et cetera, all of which schools are not particularly good at. So I think the big challenge is, can we create schools that are able to cope with a constant change environment? I hope we do.
So I guess the question is, if that's not schools and universities' strength, should you bother trying to do that? Shouldn't you sort of cede that to somebody with a bit more sort of innovation, a bit more oomph?
Well, maybe, but I think that though there's the other side of the coin in terms of the role of schools and kind of where they're starting from. So, I do think, to your point, there will be a consolidation, and it's of this industry, right? And it will happen also at the institutional level, for sure, because up until now, we've dealt with very regional markets. We've dealt with essentially a monolithic business model. And this is going away. So it will consolidate. I still think, though, that if you are taking the richness of what we have today as schools, if you are able to develop that sort of adaptive organization, then you're in a better place than somebody that just wants to sort of start from scratch without kind of a rigor. Because the other thing about this is sort of the rigor. To your point, I mean, there's so many sauces out there, and it's just obviously there's a hype of opportunities right now. there has to be a certain rigor, and that rigor comes also from evidence-based practice and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of EdTech startups. A lot of them are taking advantage of the current hype. Some of them are based in rigor and should be used and leveraged.
Well, let's think a little bit about the technology part of EdTech. Let me ask this to Charles. Is the technology up to snuff now? Is it sufficient? Is it sufficiently good for it to become a sort of global phenomenon like as people want, or is technology still holding back providers?
Well, let me ask. Je suis très content d'être ici. Don't fail me.
我很高兴来到这里。
Can someone translate? Thank you. So technology is okay in some narrow instances. Where we fail is by thinking that because we can do this, therefore everything else is possible. So the all singing, all dancing e-tutor that magically sits on our shoulder monitors everything about our learning from birth to death and guides our learning. That's the holy grail that we're nowhere near. But we could see a phenomenon of death by 1,000 cuts or opportunity by 1,000 cuts. I mean, 1,000 whatever band-aids, I guess.
1,000 flowers.
Opportunities by 1,000 band-aids. I think I just like this one. So yes, a bunch of things like this leveraged appropriately. There's a couple of other ways to think about this. First of all, if you think of education, do you view it as something that's personal or impersonal? What do you think? Impersonal, raise your hand. Okay, so most people think it should be personal, right? Do you think it's low skill or high skill?
High skill.
High skill. So if it's high skill and personal, it's neither offshoreable or automatable that easily. If, on the other hand, it is merely a lecture, low skill and low personalization, then yes, it can be automated, and that's what happens, that's what you see with, say, Khan Academy and things of that nature. So as long as education continues to push in the direction of high skill and high personalization, it is rather immune to automation and offshoring. Mm-hmm. That's just technology view of it.
Would anyone else like to jump in on that point?
I wanted to say, you said we would agree that technology will change education in a year's time. And I actually disagree with that, because I feel, to Charles's point, we're not there yet. And we operate in a K-12 environment, in a structured environment where we recruit people who crave innovation. So I understand that we are an isolated instance, but we have scale across 20 countries and hundreds of thousands of kids. But our teachers are hungry for the ability to use technology to enhance what they do, not to replace the teacher. And the solution to the global education crisis is not a click away, because as long as I am involved in education, as long as I do this work, the ability for a teacher to put his or her hand on a student's shoulder to encourage them, the personalization and the human interaction, there is a meaning of school that's beyond knowledge. And it's about building good people and good citizens and creating a peaceful world where individuals are educated. And I think for that reason, perhaps we're in search of the Holy Grail, but I don't see us finding that.
Sorry.
Can I just violently agree with Denise? And I think that too much of the discussion on this panel, but far more in the wider debate, views this as some kind of zero-sum game, that something will be replaced by something else. That's not what education is. It's not cutting a hole in someone's brain and pouring in facts. It's far more than that. It's developing a person. It's developing a personality. It's developing insight and experience. And that is very significantly enhanced by human interaction, by personal connection. But technology will transform the way that is achieved, and it will allow us to do it better. Let me give one quick example. Steinhardt, the organizers of this conference, our School of Education here at NYU, has an incredibly exciting new program called the Embedded Masters of Arts in Teaching, which allows teachers in their schools, anywhere in the country, to receive a set of online resources, online teaching opportunities, but then to enhance their teaching through group interactions that focus on their technique, their experience in their classroom without ever leaving the school in Nebraska or Idaho or wherever they happen to be. And that enhancement of their experience is achieved through technological means.
But let me just though push back a little bit. I do think, and being in a business school, I'm kind of slapping my own wrist. I do think that we need to be much more aggressive in terms of looking at technology not as a shiny new tool, but rather as solving old needs in new ways.
Yeah.
And what I mean is, we each point institutionally to our online programs, to our new gadgets, to our new things, and that implicitly reinforces this sort of either or. What we actually has to be talking about is how we are improving the impact by solving old needs in new ways. Now that's and once we start doing that, then we can start to actually evolve institutionally in terms of what do we think the future of learning looks like and what do we need to do to get there. Because if it's just about opening up an online channel or throwing out another mobile gadget, then you're not actually changing the institutional perspective on the fact that there is a better way to do something that was done in a different way yesterday. And I think that on that, schools are behind.
Yeah, I mean, just to add some thoughts, I think we're all having a go at this one. Nearly every EdTech founder I meet agrees with the premise that teachers are actually the killer app. There's very few EdTech founders I've met who are seeking to displace the teacher. And often the EdTech conversation turns into a passive-aggressive conversation of us versus them, or versus and. And, we did a big piece of work recently. We looked at 15,000 EdTech startups around the world. And there's so few which are looking to displace the current system. Most of them are actually about, there's software for teachers to share lesson plans. There's curriculum planning software, student management systems, VR, AR, internships, hiring programs. A lot of the innovation, and a lot of the word tech is what sets people off. The wheel was technology, right? I mean, it's great shorthand for something that's really difficult to describe, which is, learning innovation. And, I just encourage everyone to try and help advance this conversation with EdTech to really, hose down, to use an Australian slang, the passive-aggressive nature of a conversation that is sometimes us versus them or. Most of the innovation is actually looking to support teachers, to support institutions, and most presidents and vice chancellors I've met, they're actually way ahead of the curve in terms of thinking about innovation. But I think your comment, Giuseppe, about organizational models is the one that rings true for me, is we're all kind of stuck with the organization model that we've got, and they've been around for 900 years, and so they don't change fast. And that, to me, feels like part of the innovator's dilemma. A lot of the tech is here, right? But it's the organizational models and the innovation. But yeah, my thoughts just listening to everyone was, tech is not evil. It's not all software as a service. And the more we can point those kind of really energetic and idea-driven people in a teacher-friendly, institutional-friendly direction, I think we'll all be better off.
Okay, let's take a question from the floor.
Sure, yeah, Patrick and Giuseppe, to your point. I agree. I don't know if this didn't sound like a criticism, but it sort of, we have this technology that if we change the system in which we embed it into as well, we could have radical change, possibly incredible benefits. But we these entrepreneurs look at markets and then they look at existing markets, right? Because that's what's out there. So you have a teacher in the classroom, you make some incremental thing for them, so they have to push like 5 buttons less.
Right.
But what's the point, right? If you can make something that is far better than that, you always need humans who always need them. They might change their job description in some way, but you'll still need teachers or people like instructors.
Absolutely.
There. So I think it's more like an economical question, like what does the ecosystem look like? Where does the money come from? What's the time horizon on which we expect change? And who's willing to make these changes and sort of invest into this? And I think everyone is just kind of peeing their pants because the risks are so high, and it's kind of like if it's not broken, don't fix it. So you keep institutions powerful until it doesn't work anymore, right? Until the innovators never happened and it's just over for them.
Yeah, I think we're pretty tough on ourselves. I actually think a lot of folks are doing a lot of awesome things, and that's why it frustrates me when the conversation ends up, biased with negative. I think you're right. I think some of the most dramatic changes might not have to do with technology. If employers start to use a different proxy than the brand of an institution, for example, I mean, that's a game changer in terms of how people think about higher education. If we start to develop alternative ways of verifying skills and verifying 21st century skills, I think that will have a dramatic downstream impact on how we think of education. And that's not a technological change. That's a mindset change or a more sophisticated way of evaluating skills.
Well, sorry, I was going to say let's go on to the sort of reputation issue, because clearly people know if they're going to get a qualification from NYU or from ESA or from Harvard, then that is a globally recognized qualification. If this does expand out beyond just a sort of globally recognized brand, let's start with the students first. I think it's a question for students and employers, but let's start with the students first. What has to happen for students to know whether or not what they're buying into is legitimate and worthwhile?
I'm afraid we have to start with the employer side because that's what flows backward down to the students. And so, yes, you're absolutely right. The brand of the institution, the brand of the diploma, and the type of diploma are the shortcuts that an employer uses to decide whether to hire or not. And when I was on the employer side, I'd get a pile of resumes like this, and I would quickly sort bachelor versus master, recognizable institution versus none, and the type of degree, and I was done. And everyone wants to hire the same 5 people from fill in the blanks. Okay. And so, of course, the students on the other side hear this, and they're all petrified, and they realize that unless they all come from these top 20 university brands, they're doomed. And the pressure on the kids nowadays is insane. They're cracking up. And when you look at what career counselors are recommending they get into, well, they have really no need for university if they have done everything that's recommended by them. Quite honestly, they will have cured cancer, solved hunger in a major country, and a few other details like this before even qualifying. Oh, the SATs, of course, before even qualifying. So there's a complete broken down system here that's perpetuating on fear, because these things are also adding to the fear for legitimate reasons. If I can search, if I have algorithms to search and to have agents find things for me and analyze things for me, what type of knowledge do I need? Yeah. Is it what used to be in the books or a lot more in this? It's about expertise and transfer. Mm. It's about, as you were saying earlier, knowledge and skills and character and meta-learning, all these dimensions of an education with a capital E, not just, well, whatever was done 900 years ago. So all these things are in transition, in flux, but you have all sorts of tensions pulling the system in all directions, and it's really hard in a moment of change to see what the resulting vector is going to be.
So there's I'm looking at your T-shirt that says Google, right? It's no longer what you know, it's what you, Google knows everything. It's what you can do with what you know. And so you mentioned schools are broken. And I think if, certainly in the K-12 system, the U.S. labor statistics put out a report that said 65% of students in elementary schools today will populate jobs that have yet to be discovered. So we recognize that the way in which we do things needs to change. What is that change? How do we go about changing? And I think if you polled 1 million teachers in the K-12 system, you would recognize that they believe that their jobs are hard, they're difficult. The personalization and the analytics that they need to do to understand the levers that they need to push and pull within a student to allow that student to reach his or her maximum potential is beyond what they're able to do in a 60-minute class. So having the access to that technology and the artificial intelligence, that will be a game changer. It isn't here for us yet. But I guarantee once it is, it will be implemented very quickly because it will help to accelerate the work that teachers can do with the limited time that they have with students.
Bill, I wanted to come back to your point about reputation and brand, because I think that, I totally agree with Denise, but I think that what we're going to see is a bit of a bifurcation of the market, particularly in higher ed, where the institutions that ended up in your investigate further pile because of the brand name recognition of the institution, actually the strength of their brand and their ability to leverage that to reach students and to attract new revenue will increase in the new environment. Because the fastest growing business for Pearson right now is in online program management, where we're partnering with universities to, just as you were describing, Andy, to bring them online and to increase the physical capacity of a university where that brand reputation is worth a tremendous amount of money. Just being crass and economic about it, I think where it's going to really, really hurt are those institutions you put in that second pile. Because right now, if you look at the tuition that those two piles are charging, they're actually far more similar than they should be based on the differential value of that brand. And so it's those institutions that will have to move very fast towards a much more competency-based, much more micro-credential-based approach to the value that they deliver to the market.
Yeah, and because, let me just add that, I think, the way we buy education is as a bundle, right? It's a bundle of network, job, and learning. But learning, think of it, as parents or even as your own choice in terms of university, is probably the last one on the list in terms of when you make your choice, right? And so the problem with schools, and specifically the second tier, is how can they demonstrate that that is transformative just based on the learning? And if they can't do that compared to the other alternatives, and many of which are emerging, whether it's a job placement or a badge or whatever else, they're going to have a problem. The other one will still give you an awesome network and a great entry into the job market, because McKinsey's still going to go to Harvard to get the MBAs from Harvard. And so they'll stand that pressure. But I still think they'll need to work on their learning experience using digital and so on and so forth. But beyond the top 20, that bundle is just devalued completely.
I would like to put, sort of throw Nguyen's point slightly into reverse and ask, and in many ways, Nguyen says that technology can help you increase your pool of students. In many ways, NYU doesn't want a big pool of students because your reputation depends on the fact that you are selective and that not many people have an NYU degree. So there must be some sort of conflict there for you.
Not exactly, Bill. NYU has 57,000 students, so we are not a boutique institution. We take great pride on the scale of the activities that we pursue here and the number of students whose lives we transform. And so in that regard, it's not an institution that's focused on diminishing its scale and increasing its exclusivity.
But you have high standards for NYU.
We have high standards, but then we also have a range of different programs. But this isn't for an NYU infomercial. But
we'll take it.
But part of, I think, what you're saying is that, so much of what we've been talking about here so far has been about, America. the Western world, Western Europe. And Denise said something right at the beginning that I think was very powerful and significant. You know, there are large parts of the world where essentially there is nothing now.
Right.
And so a digital online solution, and in many of those parts of the world, iPhones and smartphones are quite prevalent. And so there is huge opportunity and potential here. One thing, look, even at a relatively advanced country like India, the underserving at the university level, let alone the K through 12 level in India, is crying out for digital solutions that can then be scaled and provide access at least to the first parts of a university education. And obviously, as one takes that concept further in the Western world and in the US, you know, we should also not be limited in our approach to education focused only on K through 12 or only on the 18 to 22-year-old market. You know, universities across this country are getting ever more deeply involved in lifelong learning. You know, one of the consequences of the modern world is the longevity that today's 18-year-olds will live until their mid-90s and will likely work until their mid-80s to pay for our pensions. But you know, the opportunity for lifelong learning, for career development, for the kind of roles of university beyond the traditional student will be part of how this universe expands. And again, I would argue very strongly, this is not a zero-sum game. There will be many opportunities for technology to enhance those non-traditional educational connections.
I'm delighted you said pension, not debt. I got afraid for a moment.
We wholeheartedly agree with you. Charles and I are actually working on a project called Equaled Education. It's a GEMS portfolio company, but essentially what we're trying to do is redefine standards in education and provide access, digital access, to children in the developing world, beginning with STEM classes, STEM education. And we do not want our digital product to replace the teacher. We want to shift in the instances where teachers don't exist and there are classrooms with no teachers and the teacher absenteeism rate is so high. So shifting the role of the teacher from content master to facilitator and nurturer and leader of discussion and conversation, and allowing students access to content that they otherwise would not have access to. And we right now are supporting thousands of girls in Ghana using satellite technology. We set up a studio in the capital city, Accra, and are delivering synchronous and asynchronous education to children to girls who would have no access. And so here's where technology is really changing the lives of children who would otherwise be in their homes.
Can I ask Denise?
We need to talk because NYU has a campus in Accra, NYU Accra, so there's a conversation there.
Denise, one question that I have about that is actually in many countries in Africa it seems that governments are sort of actively working against outsiders coming in and sort of giving this the sort of things that you're doing, which is really great. And I just wonder what your experience has been in terms of kind of getting the government on side.
It's never been my experience. I live my life on planes. We started a pilot project in Mexico that was supposed to be a few schools. It's grown across 22 states. We just launched a UDigital University in partnership with the government in Colombia, where there's in the poorest areas and most dangerous areas in Colombia where there's no access to higher education. The government is launching a university, a digital university, and we're helping to build these satellite cafes where students can come and learn together in safe places. So my experience is if you are willing to support government in a non-threatening manner, the door is always open. It's wide open.
I was just going to bring it back briefly to education technology and make a simple prediction. the most influential technology is going to be a piece of cardboard.
Which is?
Yeah.
You think so?
Because, yeah, here's why. Because all these phones that we're developing things for, the field of view is simply too small. This solves the field of view problem for cents, and all of a sudden you have a field of view that's as if it was this big, and now you have really all sorts of things that are possible. Never mind AR, VR, just field of view is going to be already huge.
In terms of sort of regulation, there's also a question of regulating a global market in developed countries as well. I wonder, in terms of, if we're talking about exporting, Australia would be a very good example of this, because I think the regulation is pretty free, right, in Australia in terms of exporting education. It's third biggest export in the country. How much can governments do to encourage the export of education?
Yeah, I love the phrase I heard, consumers are the new regulators. And I'm not sure whether that will apply to education, but you can feel it in some of the conversation when you hear parents and students, especially with respect to student debt, and especially with respect to, like we were trying to isolate before, is the delta of when you enter an institution and when you leave an institution, and what, if only you could measure that delta, because that's what you want to pay for, whether that's, network or knowledge or skills or whatever. But until we get that fancy machine to scan us on the way in and out, it will be challenging. But, education is Australia's, third largest export behind iron ore and coal. And that's principally because 1/3 of students in post-secondary education are international students. Yeah. And for my, colleagues and the presidents who I serve here in the US, it's, they're aghast that there's so many international students. But at the same time, they're envious because for many universities around the world, that's actually a critical source of funding to fund the other side of the business, the research house. Look, I think international education, if I take Australia's, it's not lax. In fact,
I meant free, not lax, really.
It's what happened in Australia was essentially, given its geographic location and diversity, was international education just became part of the fabric. But what was so fascinating is 2 years ago we had a whole bunch of folks got together with the Australian government, and we were setting targets for international education for 2025 as part of a strategy process. And 500,000 students come to Australia every year to study. About 1 million come to the US each year by comparison. And we were trying to set a target, and someone said, "Oh, imagine if we could have 1 million students in 2025." And a couple of us in the corner were kind of, laughing, bent over, kind of saying, there's 1 billion formal learners in the world. International education shouldn't be thought of about someone traveling from one country to the other to study. That education, is going online in some respects. Definitely the incumbent top brands are the best placed, because that's why, 4 million students want to travel to the US each year to study. 1 million make it here. And that's because the US is recognized as the most preferred, destination for that brand to put on that CV, to sit in that pile. And so, I think governments, definitely, they're all under funding pressure all around the world, especially in Western markets. They're all under pressure for employers to become more relevant. I think the institutions themselves are also trying to innovate as well.
An Indian business person once said to me, there's so much debate in the US and the UK about outsourcing of call centers and car factories to India. Well, we Indians have outsourced university education to you. Right. And that, in a sense, is the nature of the export business that you're describing.
What single thing could the administration do for you to make your life easier, to make EdTech more of an exportable proposition for you?
Which administration? The Trump administration?
the Trump
Are you,
administration.
there's an awful lot, the Trump administration. Unfortunately, they've targeted higher education in both the recent tax bill and a future higher education reauthorization bill by backing off, quite frankly.
And to what extent have you found that, I think it's certainly been true in Britain, and the survey seems to suggest that the US has also taken a reputational hit in the last year with foreign students wanting to get a...
Oh, that's a slightly different issue, Bill. That's visa policy, and obviously that's an area where, in this country, we would very much like the government to project a rather more welcoming image of the United States of America rather than the Trump travel bans, and the UK has a similar problem right now as well. That being said, actually at NYU and most of the leading universities in the US have not seen a drop in their international student applicants.
Can I ask if anyone on the panel has done trying to export education to China yet?
Yeah, we have significant operations in China. I think recently announced the sale of our largest, which is Wall Street English, a very large franchise-based English language learning business. We have pretty significant K-12 and university textbook, curriculum material publishing operations there. We also recently sold a large test prep franchise business there called Gedu. So there's a running theme.
Right, I was going to ask exactly.
It's a very, very challenging environment to operate in politically, and you know, I think that we recognize that it's interesting, the use of the word export. I think that's the wrong. I cringe a little bit at the use of that term, because I think that where we've gotten it wrong is where we think that we have products and services that have been validated in, you know, the U.S., UK, and that we can take them sort of whole cloth and export them into these markets. It's really much more of a long-term partnership with local players to understand how to operate there in a way that addresses market needs. And I think we have not done a great job of that in the Chinese market.
That's necessity, though, right? You're not allowed to enter China without a partner.
Correct. Well, yes, and it depends on what sector you're operating in, and obviously in the franchise model, for instance, it's a little bit different. But I think in general, whether that's the rule or not, depending on where you're playing, the practical aspect of it is there's no way that you really can without very, very strong local partners.
Okay, Andrew, then.
We have NYU has 1,000 student campus in Shanghai,
Right.
which is comprised of 50% Chinese students, 50% international students. And again, we do it not for financial reasons. We make no money from it at all. We do it for academic reasons and the opportunity that it gives for students here in New York to go and spend time in Shanghai, but also for students in China to get the benefit of a liberal arts education, which is a very different form from the traditional Chinese higher education.
Okay, question in the audience.
Yeah, I'm getting back to education after like 25 plus years, and I just wanted to toss out something about the future of education that could cross national boundaries, and it's struck me that you know, we're all born with the same human brain in our heads, except there wasn't really much of an understanding of the way the human brain works until 20 years ago. But it just seemed so, you know, obvious to me that if you just follow the way the human brain develops from birth, because the brain is only 25% developed at birth, it takes 5 years, that if you just complemented the way the brain naturally grows and develops, they say full consciousness doesn't develop until your early 20s. Like, what else can you do if this idea of research, of such elemental things, which is just coming on board now, was made available on an international level? I'm just thinking, where would this take things in terms of being something that international countries could agree on as being the way education, particularly K through 12, should go? Any ideas would be greatly appreciated.
Well, I think you're already seeing some of the globalization of the findings and learnings of learning science and learning research. And you know, it's not and and the fact that best practices may emerge anywhere in the world. You know, the charter school network that I helped founded, you know, is very involved with the IB curriculum, is using Singapore math, and you know, I think there's a less of a increasingly less preciousness about the local nature of the approaches to learning, particularly when it comes to, in many cases, to the harder disciplines, the STEM disciplines and so on, which lend themselves better to global approaches in general. But I think learning sciences is becoming a much more global phenomenon, but it's still, to your point, very early days. And while it addresses a component of the education, there's a lot of the education that still is highly local, regardless of the learning science component of it.
If I may, I mean, quite honestly, irrespective of culture and countries and so on, learning sciences, yes, made a lot of progress in the past few decades, but it's extremely narrow and small what we know. Let's be serious here. We know developmental stages for children. We know what is appropriate in terms of language acquisition, things of that nature. But can I tell you for sure that because my child has practiced music, they've become better at mathematics? Absolutely not. Can I tell you for sure that mathematics builds more, let's say, critical thinking? Absolutely not. There all sorts of contradictory information, but even things as basic as this. So saying that we want to be evidence-based, fine. Saying that we want to be learning science-based, fine to the extent possible. That's really the situation.
And that's why we do research into education. That's why we have a School of Education at NYU and many other leading universities do. And it's a relevant comment to other things that have been said from the audience and around the table. You know, we're actually screwing with people's lives here. Yeah. And you know, we have to, the talk about radical changes, blowing up this. You know, these are people's lives. There's a reason we build change on what we already know. You know, next time I have an operation in an operating theatre, I don't want my surgeon to be trying a radically new form of appendectomy on me. I want the surgeon to be using what they know and incremental advance. So we do have to be very careful that regulations around education exist because we are dealing with people's lives and critical stages in their development, just as you've said. And we've got to take that responsibility very seriously.
I agree. But as if it's not obvious to radically reduce the cost of education, like as if it's not obvious to radically increase the access to education. You know, it again frustrates the hell out of me. We have this conversation about neuroscience and we got all this stuff, and then go and sit in the classroom. You know, go and sit in. I spend half a day every month sitting in my daughter's classroom just to watch. And as a parent helper or whatever. And I sit there and just think, God, I'm wasting all my time on these apps and Teams and stuff. Like, there's some obvious things we could do in this classroom that would dramatically increase, impact, you know, my daughter's learning and the outcomes and the capabilities. Same with higher ed. I go and sit in, you know, a mate's son's class, you know, computer science. Again, I'm sitting there thinking, God, we don't need any apps to make this. You know, teachers are the killer app. There's some fundamental, I think, the organisational changes. There's some other fundamental changes that we need to make before we start tuning education like a Formula One racing car with, you know, neuroscience and the likes. It's a 900-year-old model, and that brings incredible strength and resilience. And you know, it's awesome being on a 900-year-old campus. You can just feel the, you know, the intensity of the knowledge and the tradition and the like. But there's some changes I think we need to make before we get to neuroscience that will decrease cost, increase access, and make a much bigger impact globally, let alone domestically.
Yeah, just one reflection that you brought to my mind, a little bit on a tangent, but if one good thing has come out of the whole digital, whatever we want to call it, hype, is it actually has started a conversation about learning and pedagogy and science at schools. A conversation that essentially did not exist or existed with a few.
I wouldn't agree with that. There's been a discussion about the nature of education for a long time. We now have tools to measure things that we couldn't before. That I would agree.
Well, I don't know. Maybe then I'll narrow it to business schools, but where I live, because I can tell you of the 150 professors at IESE, and I will say the same of Wharton or Columbia or whatnot, very few actually have a clue about learning and learning science and pedagogy. What they know is how to research their field, and what they know how to teach is how they've been taught by their colleague that came before them. And so the whole stirring of new opportunities and so on and so on has actually, the reason we go online is not to develop a business, but actually to learn and to start the conversation about pedagogy and how learning will be in the future. I think that is one of the biggest, let's say, benefits that has come out of this current state.
Well, and I think just to add to that, I think as we begin to deliver teaching and learning in more digitally mediated forms, we have far greater flexibility in how that learning and how the content around learning gets delivered. And so it really, the responsibility is for us to make sure we're embedding what we know about learning science and learning research into. So example, just today I was talking about this, we have completely redesigned the way that we deliver, for instance, all of our business and economics content, textbooks to students digitally. Used to be, you got a big textbook, you read the 150-page chapter, you'd fall asleep around 15 pages in, but you keep reading and realize that you didn't retain any of it, right? So we simply transferred that to a PDF, right? So for the last many, many years, it was the same exact experience, but it was even worse because,
the screen quality.
Right, and the battery would run out and you needed a cardboard box for it. So we completely redid how we deliver this sort of textbook experience in a digital environment to incorporate the whole concept of cognitive spacing and all sorts of learning science concepts. So now you only read 15 pages at a time, and there's a little assessment at the end of that to check whether you understood the concepts, and it drives you back into the text if you didn't. And the feedback from the learners has been spectacular. But I think the thing about digital versus non-digital is that you have incredible control and flexibility, and that's what makes it so appealing, over the delivery experience itself, over the consumer learner experience itself. It means that we have, the trade-off is you have tremendous responsibility as a producer to do that in a way that's really consistent with what we know about the brain.
There are downsides. 500 years from now, you could still read the textbook. You won't be able to read the PDF file.
I'd like to, as we
that is true. And you don't have to take 10 minutes to boot it up.
I said at the beginning that we would come back to the issue of talent. So I think that what we might do is just focus on the idea of talent for a bit for now, and then we might open the panel up to the floor. So start thinking of some difficult questions if you can. We have a Google campus just down the street from here. You have a education research department here. How easy is it, if we're talking about EdTech, how easy is it to compete against all of the other technology companies which seem very glamorous? How easy is it to persuade the top talent to come and work for an EdTech firm?
If you're a philosophy professor, it doesn't matter. If you're a computer science professor, you have to be paid $500,000 a year or you quit.
I mean, outside of the academic staff, I guess is the question.
Patrick said something about teachers are the killer app, and I think an app is standardized. So every time you go to the app, this is the experience that you'll get. There are expectations. You know what to expect. The app's daughter doesn't get sick in the morning or be almost 14 and a female. So I think that we have to provide teachers with the ability to also grow and be curious and nimble and agile and adaptive. And so for that, the teachers are the best asset we have. But I think we need to focus on teachers and leaders and develop leaders to help those leaders develop teachers. And I think work to create a talent pipeline, and especially in this country, do a better job of making, and again, I'm in the K-12 environment, but making the job of the teacher attractive, because there's those who can do, those who can't teach. And those are adages that are pervasive in our culture. They permeate our culture. And there's also another one that says elementary teachers love the children, secondary teachers love the content, higher ed love themselves.
So maybe just to complement, I agree with Denise's point about human capital in the teaching cadre. I think there's a complement to that, which is human capital in the product development, engineering spaces. How do we compete there? And I mean, I certainly don't want to fool myself that we can compete on a one-for-one basis with Google and Amazon and Facebook. That said, I think when we hire top talent and when we talk to them about why they joined and why they stay at a company like Pearson, it's always about the double bottom line. It's about delivering something of real value to their fellow human beings. And I know that sounds Pollyanna and self-promoting, but it's really striking how that continues to be a theme. I think, listen, there will be plenty of engineers who don't particularly see value in that for themselves, but there will be many who are tired of actually not doing something that contributes to the advancement of the human race.
Giuseppe, how many of the SA MBA students could turn up at the end of the year and say, I want to go and work for an EdTech firm rather than for a bank or for Google?
I have absolutely no idea. I can't answer that question. No, I think, but this is a trend across all business schools. The changing nature of jobs and how people are looking for jobs, the changing nature of career and the sort of 100-year life and all of that. So, I mean, I think it's a general question. I don't think it's about EdTech versus another sector. But I do think, though, that, education combines, right, on the staff side, an interesting and difficult often to find, right? Because there's the science part. And so you can get a great kind of instructional designer profile, right, that has studied and knows deeply about education. But then there's the kind of business side, right, the commercial, has no clue how to actually sort of run a business, how to engage a client and so on. Or you can get a great sort of key account manager, a great business person, and you have to sort of make them fall in love with the education side. And when I've over the years hired people, I don't know which one works better. I've tried to make people that actually have a passion for sort of business fall in love with education, but I've often got burnt because it's only 2 or 3 years down the road that they realize that, hey, it was actually that double bottom line wasn't in that person. But the ones that you do find, stay with it forever, and the rest of their life is in education, and it's great.
Okay, let's, I think any of the topics that we've so far covered, we had a huge broad range of topics, but let's take from the floor. I think the lady there was first.
Hi. So I used to work in admissions actually here at NYU in grad school admissions. And when I initially started, the majority of our international grad students were coming from China, India. And as we were progressing throughout the years, I saw some new markets that we were going into, such as South America, some areas of Southeast Asia, et cetera. So I'm interested from where you all sit, what are these specific countries or these international markets that you see in the future that will be great ways for the U.S. to collaborate with in terms of in higher ed or even through K through 12 that are beyond India and China?
Thank you. Who wants to take that?
I'm happy to take it from a K-12 perspective, and I often find, I'm glad that Luyen talked about exporting education as export almost a bad word, and looking at the need for a common understanding global standards. Another project that Charles and I are working on with the OECD is developing a global framework for education and bringing, I think we're up to 95 countries around one table, trying to get an understanding of a backward map of our graduates. So what do we aspire for our graduates to be able to do when they enter tertiary education? So I think it's not necessarily a US perspective, but more of a global perspective, because there is so much that the US can learn from other systems who have actually taken our research and innovations and just implemented them at scale, which for whatever reason we have yet to be able to do. And I think you'll see in some of these emerging markets, they may leapfrog with the use of digital because there's nothing else.
From the higher education perspective, I would say Africa, sub-Saharan Africa in particular, particularly the role that universities can play in building capacity in those countries. And often that's educating teachers. You know, it is the teaching of the teachers that becomes a critical bottleneck in many countries.
So to what extent is that an EdTech problem?
But again, you know, I hope what I've been saying all afternoon is that, of course, it's an EdTech, but in partnership with universities, because of the experience they have, because of the structures that most of those countries have already in place. You know, again, I come back, there are regulations, and there's a reason there are regulations and in all countries, and managing educational quality and enhancing it through technology is something that can be done in partnership.
Gentleman with the white shirt.
Hi, I'm an EdTech founder in the ESL space, and I just noticed that there's a huge problem in EdTech. It's a principal agent problem, in the sense that the party or entity or person purchasing something is not deriving the benefits or not using the technology. I just want to go around the panel and see if you guys have experienced that yourselves and what can be done to mitigate it.
So that is absolutely a fundamental issue in the education market. But I will just, I would just come back by saying it's different depending on what segment of education you're talking about, right? So we haven't talked a lot about consumer education, right? Consumer education is not a principal agent model. It's a direct-to-consumer model. It's if you look at the differences even in principal agent model between institutional K-12 and higher education, totally different yet again, right? Because you're dealing in many cases with large-scale government-run procurements that are multi-year, written by consultants, and very removed from the learner. Whereas what we're finding in higher ed is, while traditionally the model was very much about adoption by an instructor, which kind of guaranteed sell-through to a student, that model is now falling apart. And the end consumer, the learner, is dictating the terms of many of those relationships. And so I think it is a real issue, but I think it's very complicated across the different segments of education. And you talked about ESL. So ESL, for instance, is very different from ELT and from consumer-based English language learning, for instance, in our Wall Street English business in China, which is all about direct-to-consumer. I do think, though, that there are benefits to the principal agent model in the sense that, again, back to many of the points that folks made here, there is a validation of a product in a procurement process that is aimed at the figures of authority in the market model, and I think that creates a greater degree of guarantee that the product ultimately serves the purpose that it's intended in a way it may not in a pure consumer model, but it creates complexity, and it's harder for small companies to break in because oftentimes those relationships with the primary buyer become dominated by big players.
Yeah, it's the same in any industry. If the evaluation criteria is not transparent and there's no evaluation criteria, it becomes a sales and marketing competition or a logo. We partner with NYU, so we must be awesome. Versus a small EdTech startup competing on evidence-based outcomes, and it becomes about being able to demonstrate evidence, and ideally that starts to mitigate the principal agent issue. I mean, I think principal agent will be in procurement forever, but the more we can promote in education, and evidence is the language of education on the research side, definitely. The more we can kind of promote, I think, EdTech on evidence-based outcomes, and we're seeing a lot. It's a big conversation now, right? Because everyone's sick of evaluating 100 products and not knowing how to do it. I think the better.
Yes.
Hi. So first of all, thanks everyone for coming, and I want to compliment Andrew for taking so much criticism and doing such a good job.
Taken any criticism.
I don't think so either.
I've just heard someone say that partnering with NYU is awesome. So that's not criticism.
I think you've been bombarded a little bit, but in your response, I think I realized that there's a lot of value that universities bring that it's just online learning or EdTech just can't keep up with. And so I think that it basically is like ethics, skills, network, and job. And we have skills right now very well represented in EdTech, and everything else not very well. So one of my questions is, and I'll keep it very short, is like how can we fill the other three, right? How can we give people this experience with, in a scalable way, whether that includes technology or not. And then the other thing is just an observation. It's always funny when we talk about lifelong learners, and we always say like there's learning and there's teaching. And it seems very odd that there's no word to describe both at the same time, right? Because that's just the word you want to be using all the time. Like the learner is the teacher is the learner. That's just the way it is. And yet we have this distinction that we somehow can't undo because we like lack the language. So that's it. So it comes back to the point of like, how can we do ethics, network, and job as well as skills?
Doesn't the word education mean that? You know, it is both that. It comes from the Latin educare, to lead out, and the teacher is doing the leading out. The learner is being led out. The relationship is there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's like a grouping, but like a verb for it. You know, if you say like you educate, when you say you educate, then that's usually the teacher teaching, right? The student is not educating by learning. I don't think that's how we understand it.
There's there's a really strong conversation at the moment that the teacher is now the facilitator and also a learner. And so, I think the same way, as you do. I mean, blend them together. And I think, we're all trying to avoid sage on the stage and kind of models of being talked at and kind of reading from a book. And some of the most effective teachers, are kind of invisible, and they're a guiding hand behind you, not kind of standing in front, lecturing you. And so, I take a lot of inspiration from that conversation around teaching and learning. But I think, I always use learning for shorthand. I use learning innovation actually as my preference to EdTech, but EdTech sticks. And I think learning innovation has those qualities, like education has been known for 900 plus years. It just embodies all of those attributes.
How about a verb though?
Yeah. On your comment of how do we fill the other things online, I think this goes back again to the either-or framework that we sort of need to break down. If we look at the top schools, or let's say this split, and we look at the ones that will stick around, I think that's going to be an omni model, just like we talk about omni retail. You're going to have face-to-face experience, you're going to have blended experiences, you're going to have online experiences. They're not going to be one or the other. It's going to be all. I have this, I don't know how many of you have heard of this experiment, Minerva, Ben Nelson. Yeah. Ben, just in a nutshell, I mean, in his school, he wants to be an Ivy League sort of affordable school. In his school, lectures are online, it's a university, and everything else happens face-to-face, which is, in a way, absurd. But it actually puts the finger on the fact that he actually thought about it. He said, look, what is the need that I'm going to resolve, and how can I resolve it today in a better way? He said, lectures is a passive experience. I'm going to put it online. It's going to be interactive. It's going to be small, et cetera, but I still can't be an Ivy League school without the experience part. So we're going to live together. We're going to move around in 6 cities, et cetera, et cetera. So again, the point is not online or face-to-face or whatnot. There'll be different experiences, like there's different cars for different people. The point is actually designing each of them in the best possible way given what is possible today.
I fully agree with you. I think the question is, how do you make it scale, right? Because even if NYU has, what did you say, 55,000 students, That's way less than we would need, right? We want much more than that. So so how do we make it scale? Because once you don't use software, once you don't use computers and something that doesn't cost much to use, like a program, you now need to pay someone, or you need to pay for a location or something. So how do we make that scale, right? I mean, governments come into play here because that's why we pay taxes, right?
Does anyone who wants to take the sort of
That's why we
scalability
pay
of that?
more taxes after January the 1st.
Scale doesn't mean software as a service, you know, and humans are not in short supply in terms of scarcity. You know, if we could mobilize more teachers globally and make them awesome, we don't need to. I mean, AI. We talk about AI displacing humans. I mean, there's 1 billion latent minds in the world because we haven't yet worked out how to scale teachers and solve that problem. And I think it's important not to, you know, necessarily let the scale conversation, you know, move into, because scale in so many other tech industries is about, you know, replacing a human that has a limited kind of capacity with a machine, and then you scale it in the cloud and things like that. Scaling education, I mean, that's kind of one of the core questions of EdTech is, can you scale education? But what do we really mean, you know, when we say scale?
Education is already scaled. There are an awful lot of people studying.
Right.
So, you know, they happen to be doing it in a large number of different institutions, entities. You know, what you're really talking about is having them all doing it through a single platform.
No, that's not
you know,
what I mean.
And one can really challenge that as being a valuable advance in the educational experience.
But I think there's a genuine issue, and I interpreted what you asked slightly differently, which is that I think there is a supply-demand problem when it comes to high-quality education.
High quality.
And you can define quality in different ways, but you know, to Denise's point, we do a lot of work with developing world communities that have, you know, where the access to public education, the quality of the public education is so low that, you know, you have large-scale movements around low-cost private schooling. I mean, you know, we're talking about $100 a year or $200 a year because there just are no quality options at the public level. I think, you know, you see the sort of predictions about the growth of the higher ed population, whether you believe it or not. You know, 50 million more higher ed learners in the next decade. We don't have the physical capacity currently to educate those students on a high quality basis, and I think
there are not enough teachers.
There aren't enough teachers. There aren't enough seats, right? And so I do think, and this is
150 million plus children who have no access.
Who have no access, exactly.
And 500 million children globally who either don't have access or are in failed learning in the K-12 space, are in failed learning environments as we speak here this afternoon.
So I do think, and you know, Charles and I were talking about this before the session, you know, what maybe another way to think about it is, what could AI and what could technology liberate human teachers to really focus on, and so that we can deliver at scale sort of the base of Maslow's education hierarchy, right? I mean, is it a good use of time for the average teacher to be sitting there and I don't know the answer to this. I'm not positing an answer, right? To be grading the spelling and the grammar in the essay, or should they be focusing on the argument, on the logic of it, on the ethical questions behind it? And maybe that is a far better use of our human teachers' time than some of the more mechanical things that actually take a tremendous amount of teachers' time. So we have this big partnership with IBM Watson right now, where we're delivering cognitive tutors. So Watson is actually tutoring students in very sophisticated concepts. And it's not because Watson can do a better job than the human can, but because, frankly, there aren't enough human instructors after hours when a student is doing their homework and realizes he or she doesn't understand the concept of, whatever it is, right, photosynthesis, and needs help with it. So I think we have to think about what problem are we trying to solve in the overall ecosystem and in the value stream of education. And I think there's real opportunity for technology to solve pieces of that in a way that delivers quality at scale.
I agree, except that it cracks me up we're having a universal basic income conversation at the same time. Like, you know, we've got all these jobs are going to be displaced, and we're going to have all these people who've got nothing to do, and we're going to have to give them universal basic income. Can we develop AI to relieve the teacher so they've got more time? Like, hold on, there's this other part of society talking about universal basic income. I think it's a really, you know, fascinating time. But I don't think AI, you know, a quick test on Siri or whatever. I mean, Siri does not work for me like that.
That's your Australian accent.
Yeah, right. Potentially.
Yeah, just to wrap up this point.
I think we probably want to wrap this up now.
Yeah, I will.
We're right at the end of time, but
Okay.
I would like very much to thank the panel. I think it's been a fascinating conversation, and I think everyone would like to show their appreciation.